Hello, class. Welcome to um, BMN 507 Bible Overview. This is our sixth lecture on August the 22nd. So our sixth lecture is the seventh week of the course. So we'll have today's lecture and two more lectures. And then in 3 weeks, we will have the final exam. So just want to be sure you are ready for that. Let's go ahead and begin the lecture for today. We're going to start with chapter 10 of the textbook, which is about Jewish life and literature. This is kind of what we call the intertestamental period, the time between the Old Testament and New Testament, and even up until the era of the New Testament, setting the background for the writings of the New Testament, which we'll get more into next week. So Jewish life and literature from 200 BCE to 100 CE. All right, so the period between 200 BCE and 100 CE and beyond was one of the most vital and creative periods in the history of Judaism. From a historical perspective, this period witnessed the developing of movements within Judaism, one of which became the form of Judaism that continues to flourish to this day. That's the movement associated with the Pharisees, and another of which became a new and influential religion. That's the movement associated with Jesus of Nazareth. We know as Christianity today. So from a literary point of view, this period witnessed the creation of a number of works that are worthy of our consideration, though they did not achieve canonical status in the Tanakh, meaning they were not included in what we know as the Old Testament. We will survey some of the variety of literature of this period, and we will also supply the background essential to a full grasp of the wider historical and literary contexts of both the Tanakh and the New Testament. So we'll start with the historical world, varieties of classical Judaism, and that begins with the Maccabean period. So the Deuterocanonical book of Sirach, that we're going to talk more about later, ends its famous passage in praise of the great heroes of Israel with a reference to a contemporary of the author, that is the high priest Simon II. He was the last of the great Zadokite high priests and rulers of the Principality of Jerusalem. That was a family lineage of priests. So the rabbinic tradition also saw him as the patron of an emerging pietism, or a form of devotion or religious practice that bore Judaism's ultimate future. Early in the 2nd century BCE, the Seleucids were the overlords of Judea. They were the rulers that controlled Judea. One of the sons of Alexander began that line of the Seleucids. Their defeat by Rome in 190 meant that they owed the Romans tribute, which they exacted from subject peoples. With the coming of Antiochus Epiphanes to the throne in 175 BCE, the situation of the Jewish community worsened. Antiochus was bribed by Joshua, who took the name of Jason, into deposing his brother Onias, and then installing him as the high priest. Yet Menelaus offered a bigger bribe, so leading to an upset of the high priesthood through the Zadokite line when Menelaus instead actually became the high priest. So the process of Hellenization had been going on for at least a century by this time. However, it was not until the 170s and 160s that a strong reaction to Hellenization emerged. Polarization, persecution, and rebellion ultimately resulted. Though Rome conquered the Greek East, Hellenistic culture conquered Rome, such as the adoption of Greek gods with new Roman names. So if you're familiar with the mythologies of Greece and Rome, they're very similar. Rome just adopted more or less the Greek gods, maybe identified them with their traditional Roman gods, but gave them the Roman names. So, for instance, Zeus, I think, became Jupiter, and let's see, Poseidon became Neptune. There are several names of the Greek gods, and then also the Roman names for those gods. So a revival of Jewish pietism or religious practice in the early 2nd century led to resistance to offensive Greek customs. We'll see more of those in specific coming up the lesson. Now, after Rome thwarted an attempt by Antiochus Epiphanes to add Egypt to his empire, he instead entered Jerusalem, slaughtering innocent people and looting the temple with the cooperation of Menelaus. The temple was converted to pagan worship, and customary Jewish practices were outlawed. The Hasidim practiced passive resistance, as we mentioned last week, suffering torture and death as a consequence. A radical turning point came in the village of Modin when an apostate Jew, supported by the Seleucid troops, sought to compel a pagan sacrifice. An old priest named Mattathias led his neighbors in actually slaughtering the intruders, including that priest to begin with. Right? Though Mattathias did not survive, this resistance movement was led by 3 of his sons. First, Judas, not the Judas we know from the New Testament, but this is quite a bit earlier. So Judas, called the Maccabee, or the Hammerer. Second, Jonathan, and finally, Simon. Judas was a brilliant guerrilla fighter who, in December 164, that's 164 BCE, liberated the temple, which was cleansed and rededicated. And this is an action that's celebrated in the annual Jewish Feast of Lights, or Hanukkah. Now, during the war, there were truces, negotiations, and diplomatic explorations. Sparta and Rome pledged moral support for the Jewish rebels, but gave no tangible aid. Judas then fell in battle. Jonathan and Simon were capable warriors, but even more skilled as masters of politics. Both died as victims of treachery. Before Simon's death in 135 BCE, political independence had been won, and Simon was named high priest and king. And this began the Hasmonean dynasty. Simon had 2 strong successors, John Hyrcanus and Alexander Genius. However, the dynasty later weakened through conflicts over succession. In 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey entered Jerusalem, and the Jewish homeland was subordinated to Rome. The Hasmonean family had given Israel nearly a century of political and religious independence. It seems they were generally popular with the masses, though more devout Jews did not support them. seeing them as usurpers of both the throne. That's because they were not of the Davidic line, and also the high priesthood, because that was they were not Zadokites. They were not part of that traditional priestly family that had been the priests for many years. Rome was not the only power to exercise its influence in biblical history during the last few centuries BCE. As early as the mid-3rd century BCE, a Parthian, that also means Persian, a Parthian dynasty had begun the process of restoring Persian independence. The Romans began to view the Parthians with suspicion and hostility. Rome had been drawn to the east by instability in the Greek-speaking world and by the Eastern Mediterranean grain trade to feed Italy. Italy was agriculturally deficient on its own. That's why they needed that grain trade. Unsuccessful campaigns against Parthia were conducted, and the Parthians responded by invading the Levant, that's an eastern Mediterranean region that includes Judea. This is with an attempt to restore the Hasmonean dynasty to authority. The Parthians aided Jewish resistance to Rome. An Edomite adventurer named Antipater became involved in Hasmonean affairs. He assisted the Romans, who named his son Herod, Rome's client king of the Jews. Due to his efforts to retain the favor of Rome, Herod enjoyed a long reign. We know him as Herod the Great, by the way. He was an able ruler and ambitious builder. His most famous achievement is a grand reconstruction of the Jerusalem temple, but he was also paranoid and brought about the death of his own sons and wife. At least maybe a couple of his sons. He did have quite a few sons, and I think he killed at least 2 of them. The Jews disliked him for his violence and tyranny, as well as for patronizing paganism, such as in building temples to Augustus Caesar, while he also rebuilt the Jerusalem temple. Now, both Herod and his heirs were accountable to the Roman governor of Syria, though the Romans entrusted them with many imperial frontiers. At Herod's death, his kingdom was divided among his surviving sons, though Herod Archelaus was later removed and replaced with a Roman procurator, which means a governor. The emperor Caligula made Herod's grandson, Herod Agrippa, master of much of the original Herodian kingdom. But after Agrippa's death, Roman procurators assumed full power. Poor behavior of Roman leaders led to the outbreak of open rebellion by the Jews. The Zealot uprising that began in the year 66 CE gained major popular support through the success of early guerrilla ambushes of Roman forces. Maximum power was used to crush the rebellion. Jerusalem was captured and the temple destroyed in 70, and the last zealots perished at Masada in 73 to 74. Anti-Jewish measures under Trajan and Hadrian, those are Roman emperors, led to a second revolution in the years 132 to 135 under Simon Bar Kokhba. Again, Judea was ravaged by the power of Rome. Jerusalem was reconstructed as a pagan city, and the center of Jewish life in the homeland shifted northward into Galilee. Let's look now at the new order. John Hyrcanus was friendly with the Pharisees, and there was a falling out over his fitness to serve as high priest. Thereafter, he patronized the Sadducees, thus two different Jewish groups that we'll talk about in more detail shortly. These two new groups were evidence of a new order, as this time proved to be a turning point in Jewish history. There was a growing assortment of competing viewpoints in Judaism, though a variety of terms has been used to designate these competing viewpoints, such as parties, philosophies, and sects. We will use the term denominations. And that's because American Protestantism offers a good analogy for understanding the varieties of early classical Judaism. Of course, it's not quite the same thing, but it's just a way of comparing things to what we know. Judaism has always been a religion that emphasized deeds over creeds or over theological statements of belief. The oneness of God has been the one theological idea emphasized by Judaism. Torah was the sum of God's authoritative teaching, including laws, rules, customs, and public health measures. Torah and the temple, while the temple still stood, were central to the loyalty of all classical denominations. The disagreements among the classical Jewish denominations were about the extent of the Torah and what it established, how it was to be interpreted, and who had the authority to interpret it. An aspect of traditional Torah religious teaching that is widely misunderstood today is the notion of ritual purity and impurity, which were rooted in the notion that people must be in the correct state to approach God, enter the holy place in the temple, and touch holy things. Just as a surgeon must undergo cleansing with germicidal soap and wear protective clothing and sterile gloves to prepare to engage in an operation. So you have to be clean to be in God's presence. Physically clean or ritually clean. Okay, let's look at the Pharisees. Well, the term Pharisee is used today to refer to someone who is obsessively concerned with rules and who is self-righteous and hypocritical. This stereotype distorts this important Jewish movement. The Pharisees were a devotional movement composed largely of laity in contrast to professional religious leaders. The name means excluded or separated and may refer to their exclusion from national councils or self-separation in pursuit of ritual purity, because there are no surviving descriptions written by the Pharisees themselves, and the sources that do provide evidence of the Pharisees had biased perspectives. An accurate and unified portrayal of them may prove impossible. We shall attempt some general, though speculative remarks. In other words, we've got some idea, but in some sense, we're also guessing maybe some things we don't know for sure. So references to the occupation of Pharisaic leaders suggest that they were recruited largely from the middle orders of society. That would include tradespeople, artisans, merchants, farmers, and others, though a few were of lower rank. They did not have many adherents from the priestly class. They were apparently led by a company of lay scholar saints whose authority was their power to persuade through reason and an example rather than hereditary office or charisma. The Pharisees saw the necessity of adapting Jewish religion to the changed conditions of life in the Jewish homeland, as well as in Babylon, where they had strong connections. That's to enable ordinary Jewish people to be good Jews and still live as productive citizens. They accomplished this task through two devices. One was through free interpretation of scripture by their scholarly leaders, and the second was the notion of two Torahs, one written and the other oral, referring to the traditional teachings of the great Pharisaic scholars. The Pharisees also instructed a third device to hold in check the first two, the principle of authority, which stated that an interpretation of the Torah or a claimed oral teaching of customs could be accepted only if it could be attributed to a recognized and authoritative leader. Part of the Pharisaic program seems to have been to permit devout Israelites in Jerusalem, in the villages of Judea and Galilee, and the diaspora, which means outside Judea, to participate in the worship that the written Torah reserved for priests. So maintaining the purity called for in the Torah. Pharisaism was centered in observance of the Torah. Actions and purposes were more important than words or doctrines. The Pharisees believed that God had given the whole Torah as an express statement of his will for the people. The keeping of the Torah was not a legalistic pursuit for the favor of a cold and demanding God, but a response to the goodness of God as a loving parent. Some scholars describe the two major schools among the Pharisees: the free constructionist school of Hillel and the constructionist school of Shammai, the more strict constructionist school. These are named for the two great masters of the era. In general, the house of Shammai was inclined to follow the letter of the Torah, meaning follow it to the letter or follow it very strictly from based on what it literally says, while the house of Hillel sought out its spirit, meaning the intent, what people had, the original authors had in mind. So putting people ahead of the letter of the law in most cases. The Galilean Pharisees, who disputed points of law with Jesus, tended toward the Shemite view, while the teachings of Jesus inclined more towards the Hillelite views. We'll look more at that later in the lesson. During this period, the Pharisees evolved what was to become the characteristic Jewish attitude toward civil authority. They were willing to put up with just about any government, so long as Jewish religious practices were not utterly repressed, and so thus disavowing armed revolution despite their hatred of the Roman occupation. After the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 CE, the Pharisees emerged with a form of devotion and an institution, the synagogue, adapted to carry on Jewish life and religion. Pharisaic Judaism became Rabbinic Judaism, and virtually all forms of Judaism that exist today descend from Rabbinic Judaism. The development of the Jewish and Rabbinic form of mysticism known as Kabbalism was associated with the students of Hillel, and the earliest well-documented mystical traditions from the Academy of Yavne after 70 CE. Mysticism is a religious discipline that leads to direct encounters with the holy. In Judaism, two basic forms of mysticism developed. The first was chariot or palace mysticism, which focused on Ezekiel's vision of the chariot and described the palaces that mystics beheld as they moved through the 7 levels of heaven. at least supposedly. The second was creation mysticism, which focused on contemplation of the light of the first day of creation, as described in Genesis chapter 1. Study of Torah was central to the discipline of both scholars or both schools, and generally novices were required to be well grounded in Torah studies in order to be admitted to mystical training. Let's look now at the Sadducees. This group was composed of prominent priests and other aristocrats, and the high priest was ordinarily the head. The religion of the Pharisees seems to have been traditional and conservative, and they insisted on a strict literal interpretation of the Mosaic Torah. The leadership of the Sadducees was criticized for using violent and unethical behavior to attain its goals, and there is likely some truth in such criticism. There were differences of religious opinion between the Pharisees and Sadducees. Unlike the Pharisees, the Sadducees rejected belief in ideas such as resurrection from the dead and angels. However, they may have had deferred or submitted to the Pharisees' interpretations of rituals due to popular pressure. The temple was the power base and source of wealth for the Sadducean movement, and they were obliged to collaborate with the Romans, or at least with their Herodian clients, the kings, in order to maintain their privileged position. We'll turn now to the Essenes. A sectarian movement called the Essenes, which means purified ones, is described by the Jewish historian Josephus, the philosopher Philo, and the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder. So this sect withdrew from the sinful world to live a higher form of life. In the description of Josephus, the group sounds more like a Hellenistic sect than a Jewish sect, possibly even a community of sun worshippers or Jewish followers of the philosopher Pythagoras. Now we'll turn to the Covenanters, which possibly are the same group, but it's not certain. Covenanters, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the center of community life associated with them at Qumran, or on the northwest coast of the Dead Sea, has caused the majority of historians to conclude the community that produced the scrolls was composed of Essenes. This conclusion is based on the evidence the Essenes withdrew from Jerusalem to create a community dedicated to a purified Judaism during the period at which the Qumran settlement has been dated. However, some scholars reject identifying Qumran as an Essene outpost, and we will take this position. The Qumran community never links itself to the Essenes in the scrolls, calling themselves instead Covenanters. And they see themselves as the covenant community that remained faithful while Israel went astray. Their writings suggest that they represented the radical priestly wing of the religious movement that had been patronized by Simon the Just in the early 2nd century. They were led by a charismatic priest whom they called the Teacher of Righteousness, and their writings included apocalyptic commentaries that applied the Jewish scriptures to their own time. The community had a rigid hierarchy with faithful priests at the head. Each member had an assigned rank within his respective order, which was reviewed yearly. Some scholars think they held views concerning religious law similar to the Sadducees. One of their key documents may have been a letter from the early leaders of the sect to the high priest, which explains why the community had withdrawn and that they will return if the high priest would observe the Sadducean interpretation of the Torah rather than following the customs of the Pharisees. However, it would be confusing to identify the Covenanters as Sadducees, given their split with the Jerusalem leadership that was identified as Sadducees in other literary works of the time. And perhaps this group could be considered sectarian Sadducees, meaning they split away from the Sadducees. Nevertheless, identifying the sect as the Essenes strains interpretation of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the literary works that describe the Essenes. So it sort of makes a lot of assumptions and doesn't fully take account of the evidence. So these writers of the time, such as Josephus, wrote in a way that accommodated to Hellenistic views, giving us a name for a sect that may be the Dead Sea sect, but gave little useful data about it. So it's really hard for us to determine for sure. The Dead Sea Scrolls themselves present us with a conservative, priestly, religious sect following ancient Sadducean priestly law, but casting their future in terms of an apocalyptic reading of scripture by a charismatic priest. Evaluation of archaeological evidence, such as the discovery of female and child skeletons in this community, as well as luxury goods, suggest that earlier conclusions that the Qumran community was poor and monastic were incorrect. However, more recent attempts to reinterpret the Qumran community as a luxurious villa or ritual purification center are mistaken. Considering the archaeological data such as pottery and coins. In short, Qumran was the headquarters of a late Hellenistic or Herodian period Jewish sectarian group under priestly leadership. So this community existed during the time of Greek influence and seemingly the same time as the Herod family ruled Judea. Now, the Covenanters were radically separatist. They referred to themselves as sons of light, and they referred to everyone outside the sect, whether Jew or Gentile, as a son of darkness. Under the control of the devil, they used the name Belial to refer to the devil. The Qumran sectarians believed a great apocalyptic war was about to break out, in which the sons of light would be victorious. Afterward, Jewish life and institutions would be restored according to their teaching. The Qumran compound was built in preparation for the war. However, the conflict that occurred resulted in their being wiped out by a Roman legion, and the sect did not survive the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Apocalyptic expectations had a long history at Qumran. Overall, the Covenanters were more focused on a view of the Messiah that involved a restored anointed high priesthood than an anointed king. And now we turn to the Zealots. Josephus describes the Zealots as a fourth philosophy among the Jews, which agreed with the Pharisees on religious matters, but were set apart by their attitude toward Rome. Looking back to the Maccabean revolt, and perhaps inspired by apocalyptic excitement, they advised armed resistance against Rome, which ultimately flared into a war by 66 CE. And now we turn to the Samaritans. Tensions between Jerusalem and Samaria goes back to the foundation of Samaria as the capital of the northern kingdom, so many centuries before this. So it was intended or intensified during the post-exilic reconstruction. The Samaritans were a localized and generally conservative denomination led by hereditary priests. Their scripture consisted of only the Pentateuch. Rabbinic Judaism saw Samaritans as borderline, meaning not full Jews or not observant keepers of the Torah. The Samaritans survived the disasters of the era, but their numbers were greatly reduced over the years so that only a small group survives today. Then we have Common Judaism. The term Common Judaism has been developed to designate the customs shared by most self-conscious Jews of Galilee, or Jews of Judea, Galilee, and neighboring areas during the early classical period. Traits of Common Judaism include concern for ritual purity, maintaining modesty, and wearing traditional garments. This common core was probably for many Jews the extent of their religious observance, or all that they really did to practice their religion, and can be considered a sort of folk Judaism, which was probably the religion of a substantial part of the community. Next, we have the people of the land. Rabbinic literature described less observant members of the Galilean and Judean communities as people of the land. They probably stood outside identifiable denominations. Some were ignorant of the details of Torah religion, while others were excluded by choice, chance, poverty, or occupation. So, for example, tax collectors and prostitutes, and also those whose work made them ritually unclean. It is uncertain whether adherents of a minimal folk Judaism were included in this category, or if the term was used or reserved for the generally unobservant and blatant sinners. Some Pharisees may even have used the term to include all those who were less devout than themselves. Next, we have Hellenistic Judaism. So this term can be used to include a variety of forms of Judaism that developed after the time of Alexander. In general, it refers to those Jews who continued to consider themselves Jewish after they had become native Greek speakers and assimilated other aspects of Hellenistic culture. These Jews lived in centers of the diaspora, meaning again outside the Jewish homeland, but there was also a Greek-speaking synagogue in Jerusalem. Hellenistic Judaism did not survive the classical age. Some of it was assimilated into Christianity, some passed into the pagan world, and some accepted the rabbinic norms. The finest surviving intellectual monument of Hellenistic Judaism are the writings of the Alexandrian Jewish philosopher Philo, who used allegorical interpretation to show that Mosaic revelation, or the Torah, had anticipated and exceeded the truths later discovered by Greek philosophy. The historical writing of Josephus also reflects the influence of Hellenistic historical writing, as do the New Testament books of Luke and Acts. The Septuagint, which is abbreviated with the Roman numeral for 70, LXX, was Hellenistic Judaism's most influential legacy. The success of Rabbinic Judaism meant that this Greek translation of the Tanakh would have the most influence on Christianity, specifically the Greek-speaking Gentile church, and it gave them access to Jewish scripture. In the diaspora communities, Gentile converts to Judaism were common. Conversion required instruction and self-baptism, dunking yourself in water, reenacting, or by doing this, you are reenacting the Exodus deliverance at the Red Sea, as well as the circumcision of men. This may explain why many men remained God-fearers who participated in Jewish worship without taking the full step of conversion because they did not want to get circumcised. This would be a painful process, especially for an adult to go through that, so they did not want to do it. Okay, next we have the Nazareans. No discussion of the variety of denominations in classical Judaism would be complete without mention of the small Messianic community that arose in the 1st century CE and went on to become the world's largest religions, or world's largest religion. The rabbis of the time called this movement Nazareans because its adherents were followers of Jesus of Nazareth. Known in rabbinic sources as the Nazarene. The group called themselves the Way. In Antioch, they were called Christians, and this is the name that stuck. So let's look at a conclusion of this history. So the first 3 centuries of classical Judaism were an age of variety and creativity. This age was bounded by 2 great crises for the Jewish community. The first, which ended with the Maccabean Wars, saw an old order pass away and a new order emerge. The second was the Zealot War of national liberation against Rome in 66 to 73 CE, in which the fall of Jerusalem and destruction of the temple were the central point. These events led to the sifting of the new order. Rabbinic Judaism emerged as the normative form of Judaism, and the process of separation between traditional Judaism and the increasingly Gentile Christian movement was intensified, and that was widened actually by the Second Jewish War with Rome in 132 to 135. Next, we have the literary world. During the period between 200 BCE and 100 CE, a variety of types of religious literature not found in the Jewish canon or New Testament emerged. Collectively, these works are sometimes labeled the intertestamental literature because most of them came into existence between the times in which the Old Testament and New Testament were written. So first we have the Deuterocanon. The Deuterocanon, which means the second canon, also known as the Apocrypha, which means hidden writings. So this collection consists of works not found in the Tanakh, but included in most Septuagint manuscripts, as well as most Greek and Latin copies of the Christian Old Testament. It is widely assumed that these books were regarded as canonical by Hellenistic Jewish communities during this period, even though they were not part of the Hebrew canon. While the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christian churches included works from this grouping in their canons, most Protestant churches do not and consider the collection apocryphal because it was not part of the Hebrew canon. So Protestants don't see these works overall as scripture. So the designation deuterocanonical was adopted in the 16th century to reaffirm that these writings should have sacred authority, although they were not part of the first canon or Tanakh. And scholars now prefer the term Deuterocanon as a more descriptive and neutral designation. Apocryphal sounds kind of negative, but Deuterocanon sounds more neutral. First Esdras and First Maccabees are historical narratives. First Esdras, which is also called Third Maccabees, Third Esdras in Roman Catholic Bible, this closely parallels sections of the Hebrew canon. The First Maccabees is a straightforward narrative that covers the period from 168 to 134 BCE, when the Maccabean revolt threw off Seleucid control. Second Maccabees parallels First Maccabees, chapters 1 through 7, but stresses miracles and divine appearances while developing a theological interpretation of history and interpreting the persecution as a form of discipline. Tobit, Judith, Susanna, and Bel and the Dragon are short stories that teach moral lessons. Tobit shows how the righteousness of ordinary people is rewarded. Judith is a historical romance in which the heroic action of a woman saves her people from an oppressor. The other two works are among the additions to the book of Daniel. The wisdom of Solomon and Ecclesiasticus, the wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach. Jesus was actually a common name. It means essentially the same thing as Joshua. So this refers to someone earlier than the Jesus of Nazareth that we're more familiar with. So these are examples of wisdom literature. The Wisdom of Solomon claims to be an address by King Solomon to the rulers of the world, showing that the ethical and religious wisdom of the Tanakh is superior to the wisdom of the Gentiles. But it's actually a work of creative synthesis of ideas drawn from canonical wisdom writings and Greek concepts. Ecclesiasticus or Sirach is an old teacher's collected wisdom, an anthology of sayings, brief essays, hymns to wisdom, reflections on existence, and advice on proper conduct. The additions to the book of Esther gives Esther an explicitly religious dimension lacking in the Hebrew story. So in the book of Esther, the Hebrew version, you never find any mention of God, but in the additions to Esther, you do find multiple admission or references to God or use of God's name and things like that. So that's lacking in the Hebrew story. The story of Susanna tells how a virtuous matriarch was saved from execution by Daniel after falsely being accused of adultery. Bel and the Dragon shows Daniel exposing fraudulent pagan priests and killing a snake that pagans regarded as a god. The other additions to Daniel, the prayer of Azariah and the song of the three young men, include a collection of devotional poems. The letter of Jeremiah claims to be a letter from the prophet Jeremiah to the leaders of Judah who are about to be deported to Babylon, warning them of the dangers of idolatry. Second Esdras, which is called Fourth Esdras in Roman Catholic Bibles. This is an apocalyptic work with visions giving symbols of the end of history. Baruch is a composite work, meaning it has different parts. So that includes a confession of sins linked to Jeremiah's secretary, Baruch, a poem linking wisdom and the Torah, and poems of hope and comfort. The prayer of Manasseh is a poem the wicked king Manasseh supposedly composed while in exile in Babylon, repenting of his sins. Let's look now at the larger Apocrypha. The larger Apocrypha is the term we have selected to denote Jewish writings from this period that are not regarded as canonical by any substantial Jewish or Christian group today. Possibly the Ethiopian church accepts a few of these as scripture, but to my knowledge, that's the only Jewish church, and they're a very small segment of Christianity. They are most commonly collected, or these writings are most commonly collected and published under the title pseudepigrapha. That is a term that describes a work attributed to a famous person who did not actually write it. But actually, only some of the works in this group fit this description. So the following is representative of the types of literature within this collection. We can't examine all of them in depth. We're just going to pick a few that are representative. The letter of Arisius includes the legend of the translation of the Septuagint. Third Maccabees is a legend that explains the origin of a Jewish festival. Fourth Maccabees is a philosophical essay on the question of whether reason can rule the passions. First Enoch, or Ethiopic Enoch, is a complex anthology of apocalyptic visions, theological history, primitive science, and sayings about the Messiah, announcement of judgment, and an interpretation of Genesis. Second Enoch, or Slavonic Enoch, reveals the mysteries of creation allegedly seen by Enoch. The Sibylline Oracles uses the device of a Sibyl, that is a Greek name for an inspired woman who utters predictions of imminent events. We might use the term prophetess, to continue the prophetic tradition of announcing judgment on idolatry and the climax of history. The Greek apocalypse of Baruch, or third Baruch, is an alleged description of Baruch's journey through 5 heavens, where he learns cosmic mysteries. The Syriac apocalypse of Baruch, or second Baruch, is another report of visions. Jubilees is named after the division of world history into periods of 49 years of Jubilees. Jubilees is the 50th year after the 49 years that would celebrate things like the freedom of slaves, forgiving of debts, and returning land to the families that originally owned it. So that's where this name comes from, this period of 49 years. So 49 years of Jubilees, and this book provides commentary on the first section of the Pentateuch. The Psalms of Solomon is a collection of 18 sacred songs emphasizing Torah obedience. The Testament of the 12 Patriarchs claims to be the last testament of the sons of Jacob, with advice that seems influenced by Hellenistic moral philosophy, and with several apocalyptic sections. The Assumption of Moses refers to an alleged ascension of Moses, meaning raising into heaven, but includes only exhortations supposedly given to Joshua. The Martyrdom and Ascension of Isaiah is a compilation of a commentary on 2 Kings 21, a Christian prophecy, and a description of Isaiah's journey through 7 heavens. The Life of Adam and Eve is a tale written to continue the story of Adam and Eve after they have been expelled from Eden, combined with an apocalypse attributed to Moses. The influence of themes and imagery found in the larger Apocrypha on the New Testament is noteworthy, especially in apocalyptic passages. So, for example, the imagery associated with the Son of Man in First Enoch is evident in the Gospels because Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. Now we turn to the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the writings found in about a dozen caves in the hills on the western shore of the Dead Sea, near the ruins of the Covenanters community at Qumran. The scrolls include canonical and deuterocanonical works, but also a number of non-canonical writings from this period. The scrolls were most likely the library of the Qumran community. Many of the scrolls were copies of books from the Tanakh. Others were apocalyptic commentaries on biblical books and collections of biblical verses. The biblical documents have been of great value for the study of the history of the Tanakh. Other scrolls were original sectarian compositions, meaning that the sectarian community at Qumran wrote these writings themselves. So the sectarian compositions of the community, which supply historians with firsthand information about this group, about which little was previously known. The community rule and the Damascus Covenant document were manuals of community organization and practice. The War Scroll describes the great final struggle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, that is to usher in God's kingdom on earth. The Temple Scroll offers an idealized reconstruction of Jerusalem, especially the temple, in the form of instructions from God to Moses. A number of original sectarian Thanksgiving songs were also part of the collection. The Habakkuk commentary was the most complete of the apocalyptic commentaries that read scripture like current events. This summary is only a small sample of the total Dead Sea Scrolls. So again, there's many more we can consider. We're just picking a few as examples. All of the original scrolls were found, or all the original scrolls found were quickly published by scholars. All of the later discoveries that came directly to Israeli scholars, and quite a few other documents were also published, but much of the fragmentary material remains unpublished. The influence of the sectarian Dead Sea Scrolls on New Testament writings is a source of ongoing discussion by scholars. So, for example, a number of New Testament books use the term sons of light, which is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but not in the Tanakh. All right, let's turn now to rabbinic literature. Rabbinic literature refers to the body of traditions of Pharisaic Judaism that were circulated orally throughout most of this period and first published in written form around 200 CE, although private written sources had existed earlier. Its literary history is so complex that it cannot be used uncritically as historical data. However, with careful use, it provides a rich source for understanding the groups that created and preserved it and the historical world in which they lived. Rabbinic traditions are divided into the two categories of authority, halakha and haggadah. Halakha, which means the way or the path, lays down obligatory principles on the way people should order their personal and communal lives. Haggadah, which means narration, is devotional or inspirational, offering help to understand God and the holy life. The heart of the tradition is the Mishnah, the written form of the rabbinic oral Torah, which was officially published about 200 CE. Its contents are largely, but not exclusively, halakha. Eventually, the later rabbinic discussions of Mishnah, anecdotes about the rabbis of the Mishnah, and a great variety of other tradition were added to the Mishnah, becoming known as Gemara, meaning tradition. The combination of Mishnah and Gemara in the Talmud, or is the Talmud, the great source of rabbinic teaching. There are two editions of the Talmud, one edited in Babylon and the other in Galilee, both around 500 CE. The former is more authoritative, the Babylonian Talmud. Midrash, or biblical interpretations, is of two sorts. Halakhic Midrash may be made only on the legal sections of the biblical Torah. Haggadic Midrash may be made on any part of the Tanakh. The largest collection, the Midrash Rabbah, or the Great Mishnah, or Great Midrash, treats every book of the Tanakh. The term Targum describes the oral translations into Aramaic that synagogue readers made of the lessons from Hebrew scripture after Aramaic became the common language of Israel and the neighboring areas. The Babylonian Talmud and classical halakhic midrashim, im is the plural form of Hebrew words. So instead of the s, midrashes, it's midrashim for plural, multiple of these midrash. So these remain authoritative for traditionally observant Jews. A number of the literary forms found in rabbinic literature were used by New Testament authors, such as the parables of Jesus, which are similar to rabbinic parables, and the Haggadic Midrash Paul employs in retelling the story of Abraham. So those are things we see in the New Testament. Let's turn to chapter 11, which talks about Jesus of Nazareth. And we'll note that the New Testament contains not one, but 4 lives, meaning 4 biographies of Jesus. Every historical era since the 1st century CE has also seen a production of lives or biographies of Jesus. In this chapter, we will offer our own brief life of Jesus. When we inspect the lives of Jesus that have been written, it turns out that there are several different sorts. So we can find ourselves in this observation to serious attempts at history or biography, rather than bad works that try to connect Jesus with the latest trends of pop culture, or devotional works using a gimmick to attract readers. Such as portraying Jesus as the world's best salesman. Readers should also beware of books that seek to distance Jesus from the Jewish world of his time, or that give a very negative account of the Judaism of Jesus' time. Jesus cannot be understood unless he is understood through the perspective of 1st century Judaism. Jesus lives as a Jew lived as a Jew and instructed other Jews on how best to be obedient to the commandments revealed by God to Moses. Readers should also be on guard for anachronistic portrayals that do not fit the Jewish village agricultural world the Gospels portray. So that would be things that seem out of place time-wise in terms of history. All right. So ideas that don't fit this Jewish village agricultural world the Gospels portray, and archaeology has actually confirmed that view. Now, an example of this would be making Jesus a Hellenized philosopher, which obviously he was not that kind of philosopher. Now, before the advent of critical historical writing, attempts to reconstruct the life of Jesus were essentially harmonized retellings of the Gospels with elaboration from sources outside the canon, as well as the author's imaginations, and such works continue to be written. The introduction of critical techniques for writing, for historical writing, into the study of the New Testament has led to several different sorts of treatments of the life of Jesus. During the 19th century, critical scholars engaged in the quest for the historical Jesus sought to disconnect the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith. And they saw the Christ of faith as a creation of superstition, not a real thing. So the effort was embarrassed by the recognition of the ideological agenda that led to the selection of data and a lack of serious attention to the historical evidence. Some New Testament specialists reacted by going to the opposite extreme and declaring that the Jesus of history is unknowable, arguing that it is impossible to get behind the interpretation of Jesus in the Gospels to in the actual events, or to connect Jesus to the actual events. Others cautiously said what could be known for certain without trying to write a full biography, an approach described as the new quest for the historical Jesus. A group of scholars known as the Jesus Seminar has attracted a good deal of attention recently. The seminar was originally an interest group to study the question of which of the sayings attributed to Jesus by the Gospels he actually did, developing a detailed set of criteria. Despite extensive notes in their writings that explained the considerations that led to their conclusions, their work suffered from two flaws. First, many of the members of the seminar lacked the background in Jewish studies to make the judgments that they attempted. Second, it is unlikely that anyone could reliably manipulate the number of criteria the seminar identified, and some of it seemed overly subjective. After completing its report on what Jesus said, it turned to the reports of what Jesus did. Historical method cannot answer theological questions, such as proving the claims that gospel writers or the Apostle Paul made about Jesus, such as that he was the Messiah or Son of God. It can only identify what such religious ideas have meant to various groups of people or detect fraud or forgery in the formulation and transmission of traditions. All right, historians can reconstruct the features of the world in which Jesus was supposed to have lived, the world of the first century in the Roman Empire, and the world of Judaism in the Jewish homeland of Israel. They can also evaluate available materials and claim to bear upon things that Jesus said or did. Out of such building blocks, a picture can be constructed. Responsible historians and biographers are guided by the data and report their findings dispassionately, regardless of whether or not those findings match their own convictions. Writing a biography of Jesus is challenging, as it tends to add the passion of religious belief or disbelief to normal problems of describing ancient history and biography. We'll turn now to evidence outside the Gospels. It is obvious that the Gospels make religious claims about Jesus and appear to have been written to advance those claims, so thus historians must be careful in considering them as historical sources. A good place to begin is asking if there is information outside the Gospels and the whole New Testament that documents Jesus as a historical person, and proceeding to see what can be learned of any such sources. There are relatively few extra-canonical references to Jesus in near contemporary classical sources, so meaning ancient writings at that time outside the Bible. Only very few of those writings mention Jesus. Yet the quality of sources is much more important than their number, and two of these references stand out due to their quality. First is Josephus, the Jewish aristocrat who wrote a history of his people for the Romans, providing the best source on the last 2 centuries of Jewish history up to the Jewish revolt against Rome in 67 CE. His writings include several references to Jesus, as well as mention of John the Baptist and James, the brother of Jesus. A concise account in his Antiquities notes Jesus' role as a religious leader, his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, the tradition of the resurrection, meaning Jesus rose again back to life after he died, and the notion that the prophets had foretold about him. So the concept of a messianic prophecy that Jesus fulfilled. Given that Josephus was not a Christian, it seems the passage, if it is in fact authentic, was modified by later Christian editors. Now, a similar account, which is also disputed, occurs in a translation of Josephus' work, The Jewish War. But the most important reference to Jesus occurs in a passage about his brother James. This is also in the Antiquities, in which Josephus refers to Jesus as the alleged Christ. This was later mistranslated as Jesus who is called Christ. So this is precisely the sort of reference to Jesus that we might expect from a Jewish writer who was not a Christian or a Christian convert. It informs us that there was a person named Jesus for whom messianic claims were made, and this Jesus had a brother named James. All of this matches the information in the New Testament. Okay. The other classical treatment of Jesus is found in the Annals of the Roman historian Publius Cornelius Tacitus, who lived near the same time as Josephus. Tacitus narrated the Great Fire in Rome and described how the Emperor Nero, in order to relieve the suspicion that the fire was started on his order, blamed it on Christians and treated them cruelly. Tacitus describes how the Christians were named for Christus, seeing Christ as a proper name. And then he describes that these Christians suffered the death penalty, or that Christ actually suffered the death penalty under the reign of the Emperor Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. He further notes the spread of a superstition from Judea to Rome. He doesn't say what it is, but we can only guess if he's referring to the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. All right. So though Tacitus does not cite his sources, he was not uncritical in his reporting. Given his negative attitude toward Eastern ideas and customs, he probably would have included evidence of fraudulent origins for the Christians if he knew such evidence. Tacitus's description of Jesus, or Jesus' death during the Tiberian reign, matches the dates described in the New Testament. Now, while there are also more pagan references to Jesus in early Christianity and references to him in late rabbinic sources, these are less important. The two central references we have discussed should be adequate to establish that Jesus was in fact a historic person, and these also give evidence to about several data about Jesus that can be gathered in the New Testament. He lived during the reign of Tiberius, was executed on orders of the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate, had messianic claims made about him, whether or not he made them himself, and he had a brother named James, who also had some prominence. So let's turn now to the Gospels as sources. Where did Jesus fit? Despite this independent confirmation of New Testament material, we should not be too quick to rely on them uncritically, on these sources, as historical sources, given the evidence that the traditions contained in the Gospels were shaped to meet the concerns of the developing church. However, it would be equally irresponsible to ignore the value of the Gospels as historical sources, though some form critics seem to assume that the church of the Hellenistic world was where the gospel traditions originated. This would make them useless as historical sources on Jesus. Recent background has suggested instead that a substantial proportion of the tradition in the Gospels reflects a background in first century Judaism in the Jewish homeland. There is a strong consensus among historians and New Testament scholars of the following historical assertions about Jesus. One, he was a Galilean Jew of the first century CE. Two, he was a teacher and wonder worker and taught a doctrine of love. Three, messianic claims were made for him. Four, he was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. So these traditions are reasonable given the non-Christian sources noted earlier and by critical use of the Gospels. Additional historical assertions do not have the same consensus as these points. All right. We'll turn now to the, scholars. Scholars who specialize in the Gospels have devised several criteria to judge which sayings attributed to Jesus and stories about Jesus are authentic. These include multiple attestation, meaning it is reported in more than one independent source. Next is linguistic ability, meaning it is readily translatable back into Aramaic or Hebrew from Greek. Third is coherence, meaning it is consistent with other well-documented tradition. And then finally, we have embarrassing reports, meaning that the source reports a saying or a story that is not in the interest of the early church. So such as portraying the disciples in a bad light. A final criterion of dissimilarity has also been suggested, which says that Jesus' teaching has to be unique, and it cannot be paralleled in first century Jewish or Hellenistic teaching, or the teaching of the early church. However, this criterion is not widely supported among historians or anthropologists, and is questioned by many literary analysts. Our intention in this study is to raise the basic issue of whether the portrait of Jesus that can be determined through a critical evaluation of gospel tradition presents a person who fits into a first century CE homeland. So let's look now at the historical fit. Is the picture of Jesus derived from the Gospels, or is the picture of Jesus derived from the Gospels historically credible? There are some minor issues of historical details that cannot be totally resolved, but even if there are some errors in historical details, they are errors within the overall time frame and do not negate the general accuracy of the authors. The gospel traditions seem to have things pretty much in order, even if they were not completely familiar with the geography or history in question. Jesus is identified with the village of Nazareth, a minor community in those days, located in Lower Galilee, overlooking the valley of Jezreel and a few miles southeast of Sepphoris, which occasionally served as the provincial capital. He was pictured during his public career circulating among various towns of the area, with Capernaum as his apparent headquarters. His various travels in the hometown of other characters are authentic places plausibly located. Jesus lived and died in a land incorporated in the Roman Empire, and the gospel narratives record that fact. Jesus died by crucifixion, which was a Roman rather than a Jewish means or mode of execution, and he was condemned by a documented Roman procurator. The Gospels also reflect accurate knowledge of the organization of the Jewish community in the homeland during the first century. At least one of Jesus' disciples was a zealot. The Pharisees appear as the most frequent opponents of Jesus in arguments. The Sadducees also appear. The Sanhedrin is the highest authority in Israel, but subject to the Roman authorities. The overall picture suggests sources well informed about the world of which they spoke, or they speak. Now we turn to the ideological fit. Jesus would not have received a responsive hearing had he been totally foreign to his world. His teachings had to be chosen or had to be close enough to the ideas current in his time to be understandable to his contemporaries, even if he offered some new teachings and some of his teachings were misunderstood. Both of those things are likely. On a general level, he was familiar with the Hebrew Bible and he depended heavily on it. He frequented the synagogue in his hometown and in other communities he visited as well, as well as the temple in Jerusalem. Many of the Gospels reflect the Judaism of Jesus' day. The teachings attributed to Jesus in the Gospels had parallels in the rabbinic literature, though it can be objective that most of Jesus' disputes were with the Pharisees. It should be noted that made detailed arguments are possible only between persons with some common ground. Jesus' disputes with the Pharisees were largely over questions of the correct understanding of Torah as well as his personal authority. And most of the disputes between Jesus and the Pharisees are similar to disputes among different rabbinic authorities. We previously noted that Pharisaism of that time could be divided into two groups: the strict house of Shammai and the freer house of Hillel. In cases where distinction is possible, Jesus inclines toward the Hillelite position, and most of his disputes in Galilee seem to have been directed toward the stricter Shemite position. A notable exception occurs when it came to to the issue of divorce, in which case he sided with the strict Shemite view, which served the humanitarian end of offering great security to women than the permissive Hillelite view. The application of the title rabbi, which was closely associated with Pharisaic Judaism, to Jesus also indicates his general similarity to the group. The issue of whether or not Jesus could be considered in some sense a Pharisee cannot be answered given our limitations in understanding of the actual beliefs and practices of the Pharisees. Jesus' closest ideological similarities did seem to be with Pharisaism, but he also had major differences with them. Likewise, the Gospel of Matthew is the closest to Pharisaism among the four Gospels, subscribing to some of the views of the Pharisees, while also expressing reservations about some of their practices and reflecting hostility to rabbinic teaching or leadership at Yavne. Jesus' resemblance to the Judaism of his day is further seen in his use of parables as a teaching device, as well as rabbinic forms of arguments, such as comparing something light to something heavy. So we may conclude, therefore, that Jesus stood in basic ideological harmony with the Pharisees, but he entertained enough differences throughout to show that he was not simply a slightly deviant Pharisee. A more precise fit in the world of first century Judaism remains to be established. We'll look now at the sociological fit. So we turn now to the sociological issue, the place in first century Israelite society in which a figure like Jesus would fit. It has been observed that Jesus was given the title rabbi by both his followers and others. Further, his relationship to his immediate circle of followers was organized on the model of a rabbi and his priests, or his disciples. His appointment of a special company of 12 probably relates to the 12 original states or tribes of Israel, suggesting a new age with a new order, a new Israel. So these general sociological data tend to confirm the similarity between Jesus and the rabbinic Pharisaic Judaism, or at least locate them in the same world. It has long been assumed that there was a particular class of holy men, or Hasidim, around the turn of the era in Israel, most described as a charismatic Judaism, meaning they were empowered with a special gift. So Jesus Jesus can be seen as a compatible figure, and his charismatic authority set him apart from the Pharisaic leadership who were uneasy with his charisma, including his miracles. Jesus seems to have been associated with a charismatic form of Judaism that was to be centered in Galilee. Another Galilean charismatic named Hanina ben Dosa, who was described in rabbinic tradition. This person had numerous similarities to Jesus in terms of his healing power and the discomfort that he caused for, or caused among, conventional Pharisee groups. All right. Rabbinic propaganda written after the separation between church and synagogue portrayed Jesus as a sorcerer or a magician or someone casting spells or talking to the dead or making agreements with the power of demons. So using non-traditional ways of getting in touch with the spirit world that are condemned in the Bible, by the way. So the data concerning charismatic saints in first century Galilee are valuable in showing Jesus' place on the fringe of change, or fringe of rabbinic Judaism as a healer and wonder worker. This charismatic aspect of the ministry of Jesus, the healings, resuscitations, meaning restoring the dead to life, and exorcism, meaning casting out evil spirits, and nature miracles, meaning are these things together have created the greatest problems of credibility from readers. Some interpreters have even tried to explain away the miracles. Anthropologists note that the holy men and women of pre-technological times were believed and even expected to work miracles. In any case, Jesus had a limited view of the ability of wonders to persuade people who were not already persuaded by the gospel, and that's why he gave a parable about that, about someone coming back to life to warn their brothers, and the answer is that they already have the law and prophets, the scriptures. If they don't believe those, they're not going to believe somebody that rises from the dead. Okay, that is the end of our discussion for today about the early New Testament period and about Jesus. For the primary text, I've given you a story from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 through 43, which is about Jesus raising a dead girl to life and healing a sick woman who has been bleeding for many years. And again, you can find this on Bible Gateway if you don't have the Bible yourself. Now, for your assignments this week to get credit for attendance, I've asked you the same two questions. One, did you watch the lecture video? And two, what is a main idea that you took from this week's lecture? For the extra credit, if you want a few more points with a little more work, I said to read Mark 21 through 43, briefly summarize the story of these two healings by Jesus in this passage. Do you believe these accounts are true? And do you believe any other classes, or any other cases where holy people have performed miracles? All right. Describe any such cases that you believe or that you know about, and give reasons for your answer. So that is the assignment for today. Hope you all have a good week, and we will see you next week. All right, take care.